Hello everyone. In this video, we will be going over how to create a pivot table using C# and the Excel Interop library. Our goal will be to work with the following set of sample sales data for different colors of paint and use it to create this pivot table on the right. Let's take a look at our Visual Studio project. Currently, our code will create an instance of Excel and open the workbook containing sample sales data. It will then assign a reference to the first worksheet. If you have any questions about how to set up an Excel Interop project, please refer to the first video in the description. Let's start by initializing our pivot table. First, we have to define the range of data that we want to work with for this pivot table. Let's type range pivot data equals worksheet.range B4 to F456. In our case, our data starts at B4 and extends all the way down to F456. Next, we want to define the starting point for our pivot table. Let's type range pivot destination equals worksheet.range I4. I4 will be the starting point for our pivot table. Next, let's set the name of our table in a string variable. Let's type string pivot table name equals sales data pivot table. The next step is to define the pivot cache. The pivot cache is the Excel Interop object that represents the data we want to work with as defined in our pivot data range above. Let's type pivot cache equals pivot table workbook dot pivot caches dot add Excel pivot table source type Excel database comma pivot data. The pivot cache object is now initialized using the pivot data range. At this point, we have created all of the necessary variables to initialize a pivot table. We can tie them all together with the creation of the pivot table itself. Let's type pivot table equals worksheet.pivottables.add pivot cache, pivot destination, and pivot table name. This statement will insert a pivot table into cell I4 while referencing our sample sales data. Let's go ahead and run our code. We can see that a pivot table has been created here, although it currently contains no data. If we click into it, we can see it has been created and contains the columns for our data. If we refer back to the completed pivot table from the beginning, we can see that the values we want are the sums of sales. Let's go ahead and start there. Going back to the code, let's type pivot field, sales field equals pivot table dot pivot fields, sales. A pivot field is the object that represents any of the columns in this section over here. A pivot field can fall under any of the four orientations down here. Currently, it's not classified as any of these, so let's go back to the code. Let's define the orientation by typing salesfield.orientation equals Excel pivot field orientation dot data field. Excel pivot field orientation is an enum that lets us set the pivot field to one of those four orientations. Excel data field is equivalent to the value's orientation. I'm not exactly sure why they didn't match up to 2 by using the same name. Later on, you will see that the row's orientation is Excel row field and so on. Anyways, we also need to define the pivot table function we want to use. Let's type salesfield.function equals Excel consolidation function.Excel sum. We do this because there are several functions we can choose from. However, in our case, we just want the sum. Let's go ahead and run our code. We now have the sum of our sales data, which has been placed under the values section. We can verify that it's accurate by highlighting column F. In the bottom right corner, we can see that the total of 26,356 matches our pivot table. Now back to our code, let's add in our rows of paint color to the pivot table. To do this, we will type pivot field color rows field equals pivot table dot pivot fields color. We then set the orientation by typing color rows field dot orientation equals Excel pivot field orientation dot Excel row field. Let's run our code. We can see that the sales data has been broken down by color. Next, we can add in columns for each region. Let's type pivot field region field equals pivot table dot pivot fields region. Like before, we can set the orientation by typing region field dot orientation equals Excel pivot field orientation .xl column field. Let's run our code. Our pivot table will now show us the sales breakdown by each region. This is almost starting to look like the pivot table we saw at the beginning of this video. But what if we wanted to set a filter that allows us to choose specific dates? Going back to the code, we can do this by typing pivot field, date field equals pivot table dot pivot fields date. We then set the orientation by typing date field dot orientation equals Excel pivot field orientation dot Excel page field. Let's run our code again. We now have a filter that will allow us to select a specific date to view the sales data from that day. We now have a fully functioning pivot table. Although it works, it's not the most aesthetic table, nor the easiest to look at. We can fix this by applying a style to our table. Let's go back to our code. We can style the pivot table by typing pivottable.tablestyle2 equals pivotStyleLight16. PivotStyleLight16 happened to be the one I chose, but there is a handful of predefined styles that you can choose from. We can add stripes to the rows by setting the showTableStyleRowStripes attribute to true. We can do this by typing pivottable.showTableStyleRowStripes equal to true. Let's run our code. This table now is a nice style that is easy to read. At this point, we've written all the code to generate the table that we saw at the beginning of this video. The next topic we'll discuss is how to apply filters to a pivot table programmatically. Before, I was manually selecting different dates to filter from. However, there may be situations where you want to dynamically set these filters through the code. To do this, let's go back to our project. Let's start by filtering by just one date. To do this, we need to reference the date field filter from above. Let's type datefield.currentPage equals 3-jan-16. Setting the current page attribute will filter the table to the value we have defined. This line will only work if the value exists in our dataset, otherwise it will throw an exception. This method works well if you know for sure that the data exists ahead of time. If you don't know ahead of time, you may want to apply some checks or wrap the statement in a try-catch block. Let's go ahead and run our code. It will now display only the sales data for this day, but what if we want to filter for more than one day? Let's go back to our code. Next, we will filter for a range of dates. However, before we continue, let's comment out this line of code so that way it doesn't interfere with the next steps. We will start by creating a list that contains 3 sets of dates. In order to filter for multiple dates, we must set the Enable Multiple Page Items attribute to true. To do this, we will type datefield.enable multiple page items equal to true. For the next step, we will have to iterate through each date and check to see if it matches any of the dates we have specified in our list. To do this, let's start by creating a for loop. Let's type for int x equal to 1, x less than or equal to datefield.pivotitems.count, x++. The pivot items attribute is a list that contains all of the dates we want to iterate through. We initialize the x variable to 1, since that is how the Excel Interop library has defined the first index of the pivot items list. We may be tempted to use 0, since that's how we would normally reference the first index of a list or in an array. However, doing so here will result in an error. In the body of the loop, we will be checking if the given date is in our list. If it is not present, then we will set the visibility of that date to false. The reason why we do it this way is because every date in our filter is enabled to be visible by default. Because of this, we want to remove them from our filter only if they are not contained within our list. To do this, we will type if filteredItems.contains quotation marks plus datefield.pivotitemsx.name, then datefield.pivotitemsx.visible equals false. Let's also include the not operator at the beginning of the statement because we only want to set the visibility to false if we cannot find that specific date. Let's also include one last statement that will print the index we're currently on. Let's type console.write/r checking item plus x. Let's go ahead and run our code. As you can see, it does take a little bit of time to iterate through the list of dates. This is something you may want to be mindful of depending on how large your data set is. The end result is that this pivot table has been filtered down to the 3 dates we have specified. We can see this by looking at the dates that are still checked. That's all for this video. If you found any of the information in this video helpful, please like and subscribe to the channel. Also, if there are any topics that I haven't covered, feel free to suggest them in the comments. I may make a video about them in the future. Thanks for watching.